Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom has been out for a while now and has received nearly universal praise, being indisputably successful both critically and financially for Nintendo. I've managed to play it for a bit and I've definitely got things I want to talk about. So many things, in fact, that I've decided to resurrect a nearly 10-year dead YouTube account to voice my opinions. As you can see, however, this isn't an opinion about Tears of the Kingdom. I initially started writing my thoughts out for it, and then I realized to do that I'd really need to go in-depth with my thoughts on Breath of the Wild, and I've definitely got some things to say about that. Given how important that game is to the franchise, though, I figured I should establish where I sit as a Legend of Zelda fan. I know I really like the Zelda games and consider myself a fan, but how much of a fan? How many games have I even played? Well, I took a second to figure that out, and it turns out I've only played half of the games, none of which were the mobile ones. Do I even need to play all of them in order to voice my opinion properly? Truthfully, no. But to establish where I stand with the Zelda franchise, I figured I'd play them all so there'd be no question on just what I expect out of a Zelda game, as that is definitely critical to why I feel the way I do about Zelda's new direction. This is going to be a very lengthy process, and my thoughts could end up shifting as I go along, but I'll make sure to convey this properly if it does. I'll be making opinionatives on the games in order of release date, probably sneaking in an unrelated video here or there to avoid potential burnout and just to get some practice in as I work to also solidify the structure of these videos. I'd also like to mention really quickly that I will likely not be doing Four Swords Adventures and Triforce Heroes, since those are really made to be played with multiple people, and I doubt I'll be able to find a way to play these with at least one other person by the time I get to them. I'll also be talking about remakes, remasters of these games during their respective video only if I've played them both, since I'm not going to go out of my way to get multiple versions of a game, especially older games that will possibly cost me an arm and a leg. With all that out of the way, these are my opinions on The Legend of Zelda for the NES. For the longest time, my only experience with this title was watching videos out of sheer curiosity. I did have an NES when I was younger, but mostly played that Super Mario Bros. Duck Hunt Combo Cart, Contra, some tank game, and a few other oddballs that I don't see people talk about much. I wouldn't be introduced with Zelda until Ocarina of Time on the Nintendo 64, and it'll definitely get its time in the limelight, but over time I grew curious about the older titles. My first glimpse into the past was during my freshman year in high school when a group I'd watched called the Super Gaming Brothers started doing a playthrough of the original game. I remember looking at it not having a very high opinion. Everything looked way too similar and confusing. Link seemed like he controlled super stiffly, and I hadn't had much success with NES games in the past. Eventually though, I did give it a shot, and to my surprise, I had fun with it. Sure, I pretty much followed the guide, but I probably would have given up on it an hour in, just wandering around and not making any progress. For this playthrough, I decided to do sort of a compromise and have a dedicated map open for the overworld, only since the game's map, if you can even call it that, is nearly useless. You've got a dot and a gray box, that's it. Waiting long enough on the title screen presents to you with what is going on. Ganon, this evil pig monster, stole the Triforce of Power and now seeks to obtain Princess Zelda's Triforce of Wisdom. Zelda, presumably with the wisdom granted to her by the Triforce, breaks it into 8 separate pieces and scatters them across the land. This naturally upsets the Prince of Darkness, so he kidnaps Zelda and presumably sends his monsters to find the pieces. But it's less likely they're trying to acquire them and more prevent Link, the hero, from getting them himself. You play as Link, a green-clad Hylian who is tasked with retrieving all 8 pieces, defeating Ganon, save Princess Zelda, and by extension, Hyrule. A simple premise, but much like a Mario game, the plot isn't really what's important, for what really matters is the adventure. This is how I feel about this particular title, since after a little blurb of text, there's hardly any other dialogue beyond a few somewhat vague words from some seemingly wise men. I don't really mind this given it's not only an NES title, but also the first of many Zelda games to come. But if the story doesn't really go anywhere beyond a reason to adventure forth, the gameplay will have to pick up the slack. But does it do that? The opening screen to this game is iconic. It's just Link, no gear, 3 directions to go, and a hole. Naturally, you're going to want to go into the cave given it stands out from these 3 samey paths. Going inside rewards you with not only your first method of defending yourself, but also the famous line, "It's dangerous to go alone, take this." After this, you're free to roam around to your heart's content. What this probably means is wandering around a few screens, awkwardly stabbing at enemies, ultimately meeting your doom. Link is defeated, Ganon wins. All joking aside, it is the NES, so controls are very basic. All you have are 4 buttons and the D-pad. The D-pad moves Link around, but only in the 4 cardinal directions. This doesn't sound like much of an issue, given enemies are also stuck to this restriction, but this led me to feeling like I'd taking on some unnecessary hits, given how stiff Link actually is. Once you acquire the first sword, you swing it with the B button, while pressing the A button uses whatever item you have equipped. Pausing the game with Start brings down a menu where you can see how many Triforce pieces you've acquired up to that point, a map, and your inventory where you select what item to equip. When Link attacks with his sword, he stabs directly in front of him. This is perfectly fine for nearly all enemies, but I feel like the stab is a bit short. You gotta get right into the enemy's face if you want to hit them. This wouldn't be so bad, but a lot of enemies have ranged attacks. As long as you're facing them and not attacking though, your shield will at least block these ranged attacks. However, all enemies have touch damage, and even with an upgraded shield, you can't block it. While some enemies are a bit easier to time your attacks, given they come right at you, most of the enemies seem to just randomly move around. This still isn't too bad, with a couple of notable exceptions. 3 to be specific. The first one you'll likely encounter as early as Dungeon 3 is the Dark Nut. These enemies look like your typical knight with a sword and shield, but unlike most enemies, you can't attack them from the front. This means you have to maneuver around them in order to get in a proper hit. Like all enemies, they come in 2 variants, that being blue and red. Red being weaker than blue. Not only are they weaker, but they seem to move around more randomly than their blue counterparts. This makes them just a bit more annoying because sure, they don't hit as hard and die in less hits, but I find getting in proper hits is more difficult since they'll just haphazardly turn right toward you. The blue ones are still quite the struggle. I just found that trying to avoid them was a bit easier since they were a bit more predictable in their movements. Regardless of which variant you fight, these guys are pretty tough, and they like to not only throw a lot at you in a room, but there are often plenty of obstacles to navigate, restricting your movement, and you're often required to kill them all to either get to the next room or they're guarding the treasure. Next up on the list are the likes. These enemies won't kill you, but you'll wish they did instead. Don't get me wrong, they still do damage, but the real issue is they will consume your shield. Saved up all those rupees to afford the expensive shield? Too bad, you just had it eaten with no hope of getting it back. So if you don't have enough money to buy another one, it's back to the rupee grind. These enemies are also often in rooms with these stupid bubble enemies that make it so you're temporarily unable to attack, and they like to come at you at the worst possible moments. Last, but certainly not least, we have the Wizrobes. Like any enemy, they come in 2 different variants. These unholy abominations teleport around the room and shoot magic at you. These enemies can not only be difficult to hit, but they also require that expensive shield I mentioned earlier to deflect their magic attacks. Pair them with the likes and you'll watch your hearts drain quick. Let's take a step back from the enemies and combat real quick and talk about the overworld. After you make a file, you're immediately dropped into Hyrule with 0 direction on where to go, but for the original game, this is the purpose. You know you have to acquire the broken pieces of the Triforce and stop Ganon, and it's your job to venture forth and find these pieces on your own. I've already mentioned this cave, but what else is there? Many secrets litter the land of Hyrule. There are often caves which can have heart containers to increase your overall health, shops with stupidly expensive items, rupees that are secrets to everyone, money-making game, which is just a 2/3 chance you'll lose your hard-earned cash, and even sword upgrades. Not all of these are just open for you to enter, though, no sir. Many of these secrets will require you to burn a bush or blow a hole in a cliffside. Main issue with this, however, is that there are no descriptive features that would naturally point you to these locations. Unless you have prior knowledge, you'll end up just guessing where these secrets are. Burning bushes isn't too bad, since you have unlimited uses of the candle item, but until you get the red candle way later in the game, you have to leave the screen after using it once. This means if you miss or choose the wrong bush, you have to go back to the previous screen, then go back to where you were and try again. Caves are even worse since they're surrounded by other tiles with the same design. Not only that, but you don't have unlimited bombs. The number can be upgraded, but not until later dungeons, and even then they're expensive and in secret rooms. Your default number of bombs is 8, which sounds like a lot until you're bombing away at nothing. Run out and you either have to buy more from a shop or grind enemies. This game requires a lot of grinding. You need to grind for rupees since you'll have to spend a bunch on items, and maybe even more so if you spend a lot of bombs or if you have trouble with enemies and need to buy these potions to restore your health. Quick side note, these potions are an awesome full restore, but the process in using them isn't so awesome. For the overworld, I would definitely recommend having a map on hand since it will make getting around a bit more comfortable. They can be easily found with or without the secret entrances, so if you still want to fumble around for them as intended, that is an option. I would not recommend going without since the only map the game has is this gray rectangle. Link does have more in his arsenal than bombs and candles though. Some items can be purchased in shops, while others are acquired in the game's dungeons. Some items are pretty useful, such as the boomerang, which can not only be thrown in 8 directions, but it stuns certain enemies, making them a bit easier to approach, or the bow, which has fantastic range attack, but at the cost of 1 rupee per arrow. Some items I just don't get much use out of, such as the magic wand, since it seems like most enemies I try to use it on just brush it off. There are also items that just make Link more powerful. Previously mentioned heart containers that increase your total health, tunics that decrease the amount of damage you take overall, and swords that increase your damage. Acquiring the swords is a bit obtuse though, as entering the cave has the old man say, "Master it and you can have it," which makes no sense seeing you can't master something without using it. What he really means is you need a certain amount of heart containers first in order to take the sword. These are the only upgrades in the game that have that requirement, but are necessary for some of the encounters in the future. While I'm sure you can do a minimum heart challenge if you really want to, the game is already difficult enough for me. This section is going to be dedicated purely to the dungeons, their design, and how I feel about them. The dungeons in this game are as simple as they get. Enter the dungeon, get some keys, get the treasure inside, fight a boss, move on. They aren't super long and visually indistinct from each other except for room layout and color. Being the first game in limited hardware capabilities, they didn't get any more complicated beyond what I just described. You might have a few rooms that require entrance from a stairwell and another, are dark and require use of the candle to see, or need to be bombed to get to. Bombable walls suffer the same issue inside dungeons as in the overworld, except for they will always be in the exact center of the wall. You do not need to complete the dungeons in the exact order of 1 to 8, but some do require an item you get later to traverse single water tiles, and to defeat Ganon you have to go through all 8 before taking him on in his own. I also want to note that unlike the overworld, I do not use any online maps or guides for the dungeons since their overall structure is much easier to navigate. Dungeon 1 is as straightforward as these dungeons get. You fight basic enemies like bats, Stalfos, and little slime drops, all of which can be defeated in one hit. It introduces both locked doors that require a key to open, and switch doors that need you to push a block. These blocks can only be pushed when all enemies present are defeated. Like all dungeons, you get a compass which shows you the room the Triforce piece is in, and a map, which, unlike the overworld, actually shows you the layout of the dungeon, making navigating them a breeze. At the end of the dungeon, you will get to experience Wall Masters, which will grab Link and force him back to the entrance. The boss is this dragon with a horn that shoots 3 projectiles at you. These projectiles cannot be blocked but are fairly easy to dodge. Hitting his horn a few times causes him to explode and leave behind a heart container. Picking up the Triforce piece has you automatically leave the dungeon. Overall, it's not too bad. I appreciate the shorter length given that there's not a whole lot going on within the dungeon itself, and the amount of enemies and their types are appropriate for your first soiree into the game's main aspect. Fun fact, if you leave right after entering the dungeon, it unlocks this first door without having to use a key, giving you a bonus one if you grab them all. It's in no way necessary, but having the spare is neat in case you just want to get through the later dungeons faster. Dungeon 2 isn't any more complicated than the first one. Your enemy variety consists of these little slimes, a blue variant of the boomerang enemy, and these snakes that will charge you when you enter their line of sight. There is an old man here that gives you a hint on how to defeat the boss, but unless you've been paying attention to your explosions, I don't think Dodongo Dislike Smoke does the job all that well. Placing a bomb in the path of the Dodongo will cause it to eat the bomb and it'll explode in the beast's belly. Do this twice and the Dodongo dies. What you can also do is have the bomb explode on him and stab for the win. This boss is a bit more annoying than the first one since he constantly moves around and just turns at a moment's notice, making placing bombs a bit rough at times. There's only one here though, so it's not too bad. Get your heart container, hold the Triforce piece up high, and the dungeon is over. Much like the first one, I'd rate this as not too bad. It steps up the difficulty with more aggressive enemies and introduces the Dodongo, which is one of my favorite enemy types in the series. Oh boy, Dungeon 3. This dungeon isn't super lengthy and navigation is straightforward enough, but this dungeon is the first to introduce the Dark Nut. As mentioned previously, these knight-looking enemies are ruthless since you can't attack them head-on and they not only hurt, but also take a few swings to kill. Thankfully, their numbers are small so you won't be dogpiled quite yet, and I got quite lucky with the stopwatch drop, which makes them freeze in place, turning them, and any enemy for that matter, into a complete joke. The dungeon's treasure is the raft, which is required to enter a later dungeon. The boss is the easiest one so far, Manhandla. Just like the Dodongo, Manhandla will just move around the arena, but in an old DVD player screensaver fashion. While it can be damaged with your sword, this boss can actually be one-shot if you get a bomb to go off directly in the middle, killing all 4 mouths. If you don't defeat it in one go, its speed will increase with each mouth defeated. It's not much, but this dungeon is my favorite in the game. It's still very short, having taken me around 5-ish minutes to complete, and the layout makes it easy enough to navigate even if I did find the boss before the item, or even the map. The Dark Knots offer a step up in challenge and don't entirely overwhelm me since they aren't in rooms with high numbers. The boss is pretty fun. Any that gives me a quick kill option gets a plus in my book since it's almost always satisfying to pull off. Bonus points for this dungeon as well since green is my favorite color. Right off the bat, Dungeon 4 gets an award for originality. You actually need an item from the previous dungeon in order to get in. Taking the raft from Dungeon 3 to this platform will have Link travel away to an island which has the dungeon. This award is almost immediately negated, and then some for one simple reason. This dungeon contains the first instance of a dark room. Dark rooms are simple in design, you just need to use the candle and the room is illuminated. However, I don't like having the candle on standby since you can only have one item assigned to your B button, and every single time you want to change it, you need to pause. This doesn't take too long, but over the course of the game, these few seconds to pause, switch items, unpause will rack up. Not only that, but if you decide to not light up the room since the enemies will still show, you won't see the room's layout, which means you will bump into any and all walls and possibly get stuck and brutalized. These rooms only become more common from here and more numerous per dungeon. The main enemy you'll encounter is this weird fat thing that has wings. Killing it splits it into 2 bats. It's not that difficult, but killing them haphazardly will cause you to get swarmed later on. The item you get in this dungeon is the stepladder. It's kind of useful as it lets you traverse some water tiles, but it's limited in its use. You can only cross one water tile at a time, and sometimes I'll get awkwardly stuck on a tile since I'll try to exit, but not specific enough to let Link get off. This dungeon's boss is this Hydra-like enemy that has 2 heads you must hit. After destroying one head, it will detach and start flying around the arena while shooting projectiles at you. This, admittedly, is a pretty neat boss since it's the first that feels like an actual challenge, even if it's really due to how stiff Link is. This dungeon fits squarely into that not too bad category, but that's because the annoyances are kept to a minimum and the dungeon's length is still at what I'd consider a reasonable length. This dungeon's entrance location is weird. You need to head up Death Mountain, and in order to do that, all you need to do is climb up this staircase repeatedly. There's no indication that anything is happening, you just gotta keep going until the entrance shows up. This dungeon is another green dungeon, so bonus points? Well, yes, but they get wiped out almost immediately. The first 2 rooms are a nightmare. You go right, you fight these fox-faced things that are impervious to a lot of your equipment and jump all over the place. From my understanding, the easiest way to hurt them is with your bow, but remembering that requires 1 rupee per shot makes them one of the most expensive enemies to fight optimally. This room does get you a key, but if you go to the very next room, it's a dark room. There are 7 of these total within the dungeon. That means a third of the dungeon requires me to swap whatever I had to the candle and then back again. Menuing in this game is tedious. Let's stick with some of the positives for a moment, because this dungeon introduces Gibdos, which are these goofy mummy things that just kind of wander around. I like these guys, and they only get better as the games go on. This dungeon is also where you can buy a bomb capacity upgrade, and I would 100% recommend you get it. If you don't have the rupees, then get them. 8 bombs is simply not enough, especially since this dungeon has 3 Dodongo. This dungeon is the first to introduce boss enemies in a common fashion. You need, at minimum, 3 bombs to clear this room. Let's assume you're not going for a quick kill though. That will require 6 bombs to defeat all 3. Without the upgrade, you have a grand total of 2 bombs leeway, and given how randomly these guys meander around, this is insanely easy to miss. In this particular playthrough, I got 2 out of the 3 and had to back out. Luckily, I did get more from the enemies in the next room, but still, these aren't even optional as you have to get through this door right here as it leads to the dungeon's treasure, which is required to beat the boss. Remember Darknuts from Dungeon 3? They make their triumphant return here, in their blue variant, which makes them stronger and target Link a bit more than their counterpart. But they are also much more numerous. There are 2 rooms of Darknuts leading to the treasure, and you have to kill them to move these blocks to progress. I died, and luckily death just sends you back to the entrance of the dungeon, but with only 3 hearts. Everything respawns though, so I had to defeat not only the Darknut, but I had to go through the Dodongos again. The treasure in this dungeon is the flute. In the overworld, the flute summons a tornado that takes you to the entrances of dungeons you've entered, which does make traversing the overworld a bit easier since it can get you closer to your next objective. The flute is also required to defeat the boss, as it is invincible until you play it. To be fair, there is an old man in this dungeon that alludes to it, and the hint isn't quite as abstract as some of the others can be. This boss isn't too hard. It's really just the 4 statues in the corners constantly shooting projectiles at you that really make it challenging. This dungeon's just frustrating. It makes sense given it's the back half, but the leap in difficulty from the first 4 to the last 4 is a bit much, all too fast for my liking. Dungeon 6 is where the kitty gloves come off. I would recommend 2 things before even going in here. Get the bigger shield and have the magic potion. The former because it introduces whiz robes, the latter for the health restore so you don't spend a bunch of time dying and grinding for health. Unlike other enemies, this dungeon has both variants of the whiz robes and throws them at you right away. They both shoot projectiles that can only be deflected with the big shield. The difference between them is the brown ones will teleport around the arena while the blue ones will always wander. The brown ones do at least give you a few seconds before they fire their magic so you can dodge, but the blue ones kind of just do their own thing. Not only that, but this dungeon also includes the like. As stated earlier, likes will eat your shield. I've never liked likes. They are super hard to defeat, but they also have bubbles around them sometimes, which when you get hit by these, you lose your ability to attack, making you extremely vulnerable. The number of enemies per room at this point is also quite higher than the other dungeons, and your combat abilities will be heavily tested from here on out. This dungeon's treasure is the magic rod, which I already stated felt really useless to me. The boss of this dungeon is Goma, which is its first incarnation and becomes a mainstay boss within the series. To defeat it, you need to shoot its eye. Easier said than done, given you need to attack it when it's open while also dodging the constant barrage of projectiles it fires at you. Thankfully, it doesn't take too many arrows to defeat. The flute is required for this dungeon. Playing it at this pond directly next to a fairy pond causes the water to drain, revealing the entrance. Admittedly, this dungeon isn't quite as bad as 6, with only one real annoyance aside from those stupid dark rooms. That being Mr. Grumble Grumble. In all fairness, this room isn't actually hard to get through. It has one guard who says grumble grumble, no enemies, it's not a dark room, and once you clear him, he's gone forever. The problem with this room is that there is absolutely zero indication on what you're supposed to do here. Grumble grumble means nothing. That doesn't tell me he's hungry, it doesn't tell me he wants meat. In fact, the meat is a one-use item that's acquired in a shop and it's super expensive to boot. I only had it because I knew I'd need it. If there is a hint somewhere in the world to clue you in onto this, I wish I knew where it was, but as far as I'm aware, there's just no hint. Beyond that, the dungeon is pretty bog standard but lengthy compared to the others. You do have to face several repeat boss rooms with the big eyeball and dodongos, but nothing extraneous beyond that. The boss isn't even unique, it's just a retread of the first dungeon's boss, but it can take a few more hits. The item you get in here isn't very rewarding either. It's the red candle, an upgrade to the blue candle. It's an improvement since it lets you light unlimited fires per screen instead of one, but by this time, you don't actually need it. Once again, props for a green tile set. Overall, the dungeon swings back to alright, but the length combined with the lack of variety in room design left me feeling a bit fatigued by the end. Dungeon 8 is hidden away in a bush, and amusingly is the first one I actually found. Right away, it's not messing around. Dark rooms, boss enemies, and the actual variety per room starts to finally ramp up. You thought dark nuts were rough? Here they are, but now you have statues shooting projectiles at you the whole time. Manhandler returns. Twice, but it's as easy as it ever was. Golma comes back as well, but his arena doesn't restrict your movement like it did in the previous dungeon. Bubbles also become increasingly common, and they're even partying with dark nuts too. The item is super disappointing. It's a book that increases the damage of your magic rod, which I don't use. Maybe this would make it so that it can finally hurt some of the enemies it didn't beforehand, but I had already written it off. The boss is the Hydra enemy again, but this time he has 4 heads instead of 2. I don't know what it was about this dungeon, but I actually didn't have as hard of a time as with Dungeon 7, and finished it in about half the time. It left me with a pretty good feeling as I headed out to Ganon's dungeon. I know this game is almost 40 years old at this point, but I still feel compelled to have a spoiler warning. For anyone who hasn't played yet that really wants to, I'd recommend going into the climactic dungeon blind with a small asterisk I will mention in the next bit. Remember how I said I would only recommend a map for the overworld? Well, that was only partially true. Ganon's dungeon is gruelingly long, especially if you don't come in prepared. It's located on Death Mountain in a hole in these rocks known as Twin Peaks. All the other 8 dungeons were child's play compared to this. Ganon's dungeon pulls no punches and has everything that made the other ones challenging. Dark rooms, high enemy counts, all varieties of enemies, bosses, frustrating enemy combos. If I had an issue with the previous dungeon, you bet your ass it was here. The dungeon itself is massive. There are so many rooms and you need to use these staircases which take you all over the place to get through to the final boss. There are 2 treasures within this behemoth, the red ring for extra defense and the silver arrows. I'd recommend going out of your way to get the ring, but the silver arrows are absolutely required to beat Ganon. I died so many times going through this labyrinth, but I pressed onward and finally reached Ganon himself. The other bosses range from easy to annoying, but Ganon really takes the cake. He's not fun to fight. He teleports around the room and shoots projectiles at you, but he's invisible the entire time, so you have to blindly swing your sword until you hit him. Thankfully, he only takes what feels like 3 hits before he becomes weakened, which is indicated by this red color. You shoot him with 1 silver arrow and bam! Ganon is reduced to an absolute bloody mess on the floor with the Triforce of Power. Metal. This dungeon's not fun. It's too long for its own good, you get warped around with these stairs, and there isn't any straightforward path to your destination here. The map doesn't even help so much because of the sheer number of rooms present. Though I do like how it's designed like a skull, which is very fitting. After eviscerating the Prince of Darkness, you head on into the next room and reunite with Princess Zelda, restoring peace to Hyrule and all is well within the land. At least for the time being. I debated whether to discuss sound before the game's structure and dungeons, and in reality it would probably make more sense to do so, but this is an NES game and that means there really isn't much to talk about. The soundtrack consists of 5 songs total, 1 for the title screen, 1 for the overworld, 1 for dungeons 1 through 8, 1 for Ganon's dungeon, and finally, a credits theme. What's here is absolutely iconic, but everything will be further expanded upon in future installments. These tunes are also rather short, lasting no longer than a minute each. 8-bit tunes do have a special place in my heart, but when looking up Zelda music, there really isn't much reason to listen to these. There are also 2 jingles, one for secrets and one for get items, which have more or less remained the same ever since, and that's pretty cool. The rest of the sound within the game is fine. The sword sounds sword-like, but I'm not a huge fan of the beam sound effect. It's just a bit odd to me. The deflect noise is satisfying, and collecting items always feels good. The only other gripe I have with the game's sound design is the aforementioned not much to explain here that hasn't already been said, so... This game is undoubtedly rough around the edges. The controls are solid but stiff, the world is pretty vast but very same looking, and the music is super iconic but incredibly short and repetitive. The enemies are pretty vast in number, but they basically boil down to one of 3 strategies: wander aimlessly, shoot, or chase Link. Most of the dungeons, unarguably the game's main draw, just fall under an okay rank for me, with only one being fun, and one being straight up not fun. Hyrule is a pain to navigate without some form of previous knowledge or outside assistance. Thankfully, when you get to the dungeons, they can be mostly done without any of that. Do I consider this game good though? It's fine. At the very least, I could see myself returning to this, but it certainly wouldn't be my first choice. It's the very first game in a long-running series, and it certainly shows. It is the start of many things that will be retained within the series, and thankfully each future installment takes this winning formula and refines it. Ultimately, there isn't much reason to go back to the first game anymore, except for maybe nostalgia or curiosity. But that doesn't make it bad. If anything, it just goes to show how far along the games in the future have come. Give it a look if you're curious, but you don't really need to play this one to get the true Zelda experience. Thank you for watching, and next time I return to the Zelda franchise, I'll be talking about Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link for the NES.